Here. Uh, Good morning, everybody. Mark Zusman from Willamette Week. Really delighted to be here with Steve Pedery, who's the Conservation Director for Oregon Wild. Steve, can you just give us a brief thumbnail of your organization and your role within that organization?
Sure. Oregon Wild is an environmental organization that works on protecting public lands, wildlife, and forests in the state. We got started back in the 1970s, and we've really worked over the years to try and protect some of the big wild places the state has left from development, improve policies around logging, around habitat destruction to try and do a better job protecting fish and wildlife. And in the last decade, a lot of our focus has really been on trying to shift from kind of our traditional industrial forestry model in Oregon to things that are both better for the environment and more focused on actually protecting homes and communities from fire. And yeah, this week feels a little bit like being trapped in Groundhog Day.
So, Steve, we want to talk about that and some policy, but first, just here I am sitting in Portland, looking up at a pink sky, reading notices about getting ready to evacuate in Clackamas County. You've been doing this for some time. Can you give us some sense of historical context? How bad is this fire compared to other Oregon forest fire seasons?
I think certainly to fire seasons in sort of recent Oregon experience, going back to World War II, this is on par with maybe the Tillamook burn in terms of acreage affected. It's a little difficult to put it in that longer term historical context. The folks who looked at some of that historic data have pointed out there have been really big fires in Oregon history before white settlement. Large fires were the norm. And I think that's a little bit of what we're struggling with, across the West and now in Oregon today. Is this is just out of our frame of reference. We've sort of, developed this culture around fire and the thought that, this is not normal. And to some extent, a lot of these forests evolved with fire, and we've sort of created situations unintentionally, with the best of intentions, that are now big problems. And bills coming due.
And I want to get to that, Steve, but it does also seem to me that in addition to the size of the number of acres that are currently being burned, which strikes me as close to a record for Oregon, it also seems to be threatening the metropolitan area in a way that I don't recall in my 40-some years in this state.
Yeah, I mean, we're seeing these fires are all fires are to some extent weather driven. These fires, because of this unusual condition of high winds blowing out of the east, pushing the fire down into the valley, have pushed fires into forests that typically don't burn very frequently. And I think that's one of the things that is important to recognize here. We're not talking about dry ponderosa pine forests in eastern Oregon that, before white settlement burned on a 7-year fire interval. We're talking about temperate Douglas fir rainforest that burns on a 100, 200-year cycle. So this is not normal in the frame of reference that I think we collectively have as a society today. And it's pushing these fires into populated areas. And I think a lot of the frustration that the folks in the environmental community have had about the fire debate in the past is it ultimately almost immediately gets wrapped around the axles of logging somewhere remote. This is really putting things front and center for people in suburban Portland. People in Medford, Medford proper, are dealing with fire right now. So that's different.
Steve, one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you is in the last couple of days, there has been some reporting about the fact that Governor Brown, about a year ago, convened a group of individuals to come up with basically a proposal on how to have the state better prepare for wildfires. And it was a laundry list of things having to do with utility codes, building codes, fire suppression. And I know that proposal was not adopted, in part because it took place during the legislative session when the Republicans had a walkout. And there's been some talk that had that proposal been in place We may have saved a lot of acreage and maybe some lives, but your organization was critical of that proposal pretty much from the outset. So I'm wondering, for those of us who are lay people, if you can sort of walk through what the governor's proposal would have done and why you don't think it would have helped.
So I think, to clarify, there was good and bad in the governor's proposal, and a lot of the good, the focus on building codes, the focus on thinning in and around communities, the focus on helping property owners sort of prepare for fire, had a lot of very strong support. The challenge with that proposal is that stuff, as typically happens in Oregon, sort of got shunted to the side, and the discussion shifted to how can the state invest in new timber capacity, mostly focused in Eastern Oregon, to thin forests. And, you know, there's places where thinning makes a lot of sense. I think thinning in and around homes and communities is sort of a no-brainer. As the experience this week has pointed out, if we're going to make public investments, that's the logical place to start. The challenge is those things are not very economically attractive to the timber industry. You know, taking small trees out of the wild and urban interface is not a big profit maker. So the conversation almost immediately shifts to where is there actually an intersection of thinning and logging and economically lucrative lands, which immediately shifts us back to that conversation of logging in more remote places, logging where we still have big trees left in Oregon. They're economically attractive. There's certainly places on the east side and, you know, on the west side, particularly in Southwest Oregon, where there is a sweet spot where you can have some of these thinning projects that are economically lucrative. But a lot of what we're talking about here that is really going to make a difference for protecting homes and communities from fire is not taking big trees somewhere. It's doing a lot of thinning in the wild and urban interface. And we just got very frustrated with that proposal. It was very timber driven. It suggested the state make a large investment in basically creating and subsidizing new timber mills, particularly in Eastern Oregon. And it just seemed to miss the point that, you know, what we're dealing with here is a weather and climate driven sort of slow moving train wreck. It just picked up speed this week. We just experienced it in a big way. And the solution to this is not, you know, just taking off my hat as an environmentalist, but just as a human who lives in Oregon, who cares about these places and cares about my community. You don't protect a community by logging a mountaintop 50 miles away. You protect a community by helping people prepare their property for fire, for focusing on areas that are going to be the corridors fire is going to travel to get into these more vulnerable places. And it's just so frustrating. You know, it is, I liken it to Groundhog Day. To every fire season, we have a good conversation about what are the steps we can take to actually protect people, protect property, protect lives. And then once that cools, we go right back to the old argument of how can we make this something that works for the timber industry in Oregon.